Welcome to week 8. We'll be following on from Keynesian political economy that we discussed last week, and we'll be dealing now with developments in post-Keynesian political economy. And as with each lecture so far, we'll proceed in the following way. We'll begin by trying to identify the problem to which the theorists are responding, the parameters of their response, and then finally we'll briefly consider those critical questions that Stilwell asked, the questions that Stilwell thinks institutionalists ask, but we'll apply them to theory itself. So who gains, who loses, and does it matter? Last week when we looked at Keynesian political economy, we presented Keynes's problem in terms of trying to explain why the great crash of 1929 and the early 1930s had occurred, why investment was riddled with uncertainties and the effects of this on the real economy. And we also noted, following Argyris, that unemployment was the central issue of Keynes's day. We noticed that Keynes's response was to formulate the idea of effective demand, that unemployment could be resolved by government investment in roads, in public infrastructure, and in other measures to provide employment and to boost consumption. We noticed that the idea was that this would kickstart confidence on the part of producers, who would then be more likely to themselves employ people again. So employment, as John King will say in his reading, a reading that I've included in addition to the ones that are in Stilwell's reader, John King will say that employment is determined by the product market, by the producers willing to employ people, based on the producers' confidence that they'll be able to sell their product on the market. And for that, you need to have confidence that consumers are going to buy it. There'll be a market for it. And Keynes was attempting to reply to that problem with a series of ideas about how to boost effective demand and respond to unemployment. The problem of post-Keynesian economics is not dissimilar. It does also deal with unemployment, as Hobsbawm, the Marxian historian, has written. Hobsbawm has noted that during this period, unemployment was very much recognised as the central problem of the period as well, this post-war period. Next to war, unemployment has been the most widespread, the most insidious, and the most corroding malady of our generation. It's one that was very much the one that post-Keynesian economists were also trying to respond to. Paul Samuelson would also note around this time in 1943 that he expected some 10 million men to be thrown onto the labour market, and that a serious effort would be needed to prevent the greatest period of unemployment and industrial dislocation which any economy has ever faced. So you can see that economists were very concerned about a rise in unemployment on the end of the war, when the war ended. Another future Nobel laureate, Gunnar Myrdal, had predicted too that post-war economic turmoil could be so severe that it might even generate an epidemic of violence if it were not contained. So the question became, what causes unemployment? How might it be overcome? And this does seem to be more of a technical question about how to use all of the available productive resources. Although it should also be said that Kalesky, a Polish economist who actually himself independently came upon a theory that was very similar to Keynes's theory of effective demand, and he did that actually a couple of years earlier than Keynes did, publishing this in French and Polish, not in English. The idea for Kalesky is that unemployment is also a moral question about power and autonomy. So there's a little lesson there. It's always better to publish in English than in French or Polish. So in sum, the problem of the time was unemployment and how it might be overcome, but it had a different historical origin in that it grew not out of the great crash of 1929 as the Keynesian problem had grown. It grew out of the ending of war, with men returning to who had fought in war, returning to their home countries to find themselves in need of jobs. The economies needed to shift to be doing something different in this post-war period. But we'll also see later on in the century, as financial markets become increasingly complex, Minsky will explain unemployment as an effect also of financial instability. A financial instability that is the result of a phenomenon much like the one that Keynes felt had informed the crash of 1929. So although the post-Keynesians in the immediate post-war period were really concerned about the unemployment caused by that resulted from men returning from war to economies that were not yet equipped to provide them with employment straight away, Minsky later on in the century, and Minsky is one of your required readings, would also still want to, and counts as a post-Keynesian too, would also still want to view the problem as unemployment as an effect of financial instability. So there were those two aspects going on. So the answers will both be slightly different. For Kalesky's response to unemployment in the post-war period will be that governments need to help to shore up effective demand. For Minsky, writing later on in the century, Minsky will explain unemployment in terms of the instability of financial markets and the effect that this instability has on effective demand. So Minsky wants also to overcome that instability in some way. He's concerned that the uncertainties of investment, the tendency of people to speculate, to engage in speculation on the market and buy and sell shares is not based on any judgment of the underlying health of an economy, but rather of expectations of a quick profit if quickly sold on. So Minsky's response will be, well, to try and map out ways to overcome instability in financial markets due to its effect on due to its impact on effective demand. So both of them are concerned about securing effective demand, but in slightly different ways due to the specific nature of the problem that they're facing, which is slightly different for each of them. So let's look briefly at some of these definitions that are cropping up in your reading for this week. Fiscal policy. Fiscal policy are those policies that governments use to have an effect on macroeconomic indicators. And in some, it's really just anything that a government does to control the economy. It's a government, for example, might try to adjust tax rates and not just spend. It might adjust tax rates, the thresholds for taxation and so forth. A government might try to determine the rates and types of public investment. A government might also enact policies to boost consumption, and they might do all of these as a kind of package designed to try to have an impact upon different parts of the economy. During COVID, we saw the government engage in all of these, really. I recall my parents receiving 2 lots of $750 payments because they qualified for that. And that was intended to go to those people in an economy who were most likely to spend immediately. And they did spend it immediately. They purchased things that they hadn't yet purchased before, like a new TV. And government might do this to try to control unemployment rates, to control inflation, to stop prices from going up, to try and ensure that business cycles remain stable. But because sometimes consumption boosts can increase spending and potentially inflation, they might need to use other measures to control inflation and to encourage savings. So this whole kind of package of government policy around the economic activity is called fiscal policy. Governments might also engage these strategies to influence the interest rates that are set by banks in what's now become known as the neoclassical synthesis, which is a kind of like a joining up of Keynesian approaches and neoclassical economics. Fiscal policy is now really based on this idea of governments trying to have an impact upon economic activity in ways that affect the supply and demand relationship and the relationship to price. Spending stimulus, public investment in infrastructure and so forth. Now, monetary policy is not the actions of government at all, but the actions of a central bank, a currency board, or any other similar regulatory committee. A central bank is a financial institution that regulates the money supply and the interest rates of the monetary system. It might even do things like introduce a central bank digital currency. So monetary policy is not so much the effect of not government policy at all, but the actions of a central bank. The central bank might, for example, determine the size and rate of growth in the money supply, which in turn affects interest rates. And it might also determine how much money banks need to keep in their vault, bank reserves. It might use interest rates to control inflation. Low interest rates will encourage taking on debt to finance production. And this brings with it the risk of potentially increasing inflation if consumption increases at faster rates than production. High interest rates, conversely, can encourage savings rather than spending, and rather than taking on debt to finance production. And this can potentially reduce inflation, since the reduction of demand will lower prices, assuming that production does not diminish to respond to reduced demand. So the monetary actions of a central bank can also have a big effect on the economy. And those are the terms that you would have no doubt heard many times without always fully understanding them. That's the kind of broad difference between fiscal policy and monetary policy. So it's good, unless you've already done ECO 1 RIG, which is the first year macroeconomics subject that politics, philosophy and economics students will be doing. It's good to remind ourselves of what they mean. So here I follow John King's 2013 article, which is required reading for you this week. John King is an emeritus professor in economics at La Trobe and a well-known, globally speaking, a well-known historian of economic thought who would probably be counted as both post-Keynesian and Marxist. He tries to recover the lost histories of relatively unknown economic thinkers. And it's to him, to be honest, that I owe my own interest in economics, as we co-taught a unit on economics and ethics in 2012, which really started me off on my own love of economics in its link to history and political theory. So thank you to John. So following on John King's account, we're now going to have a look at the impact of post-Keynesian approaches on what Kalesky and Kovalich have termed the crucial reform of capitalism. So the key point that I want to make is that Post-Keynesian approaches informed these crucial reforms of capitalism in this post-war period, and that European countries in particular came to reflect 5 principles of post-war social democracy, which I'll explain in a moment after we look at Kalesky. 5 principles of post-war social democracy that really expressed Keynes's view that unemployment could be overcome by boosting effective demand in the product market. By that I mean techniques that encouraged confidence by producers to employ more workers because they knew that their product would find a market. They'd find a consumer to purchase it. And so that's the first key point, that European countries in the post-war period reflected post-Keynesian ideas about boosting effective demand. And they're reflected in these 5 principles, which we'll discuss in a moment. The second key point is that from 1970s onwards, almost immediately after Kalesky and Kovalich's 1971 reflection on how capitalism had been crucially reformed, it so happened, ironically, that this crucial reform was reversed. Yes, ironic. So from the 1970s onwards, we find the undoing of the post-Keynesian reforms that had been attempted to try to achieve full employment across European countries that had been decimated by war. So from the end of the 40s all the way up to the 70s, we see a kind of hegemony of post-Keynesian thought in the European countries. But from the mid-1970s, we see very much the undoing of this consensus about how healthy economies would need to have support from government. And we see the increasing rise of neoliberal approaches to economic activity from the mid-1970s onwards. And that's why next week we're going to turn to Austrian and neoliberal theories of political economy to make sense of this period from the mid-1970s onwards, where economies began to change in how governments conceptualize their own role. So to attempt a summary of Kalesky's answer and then look at some of the details, we would say that he thinks that unemployment is caused by deficiencies in effective demand. He thinks that the political unwillingness of business leaders to overcome unemployment is actually due to a desire for continued power by business leaders over the working class. And you'll see why this has a Marxist ring to it. A third element of his answer is that unemployment can be overcome by shoring up effective demand. And he calls this the crucial reform, which has the potential to make capitalism acceptable. So unemployment can be overcome by government activity to help boost consumption, to boost production, and this change is driven primarily in the product market by the action of government to boost the product market. Kalesky will later describe the reforms of the golden years in the post-war period as underwritten by the crucial reform of capitalism. Up until 1945, we saw centrally controlled capitalism, also visible in the war years when economies were oriented towards the sorts of production that would support the war effort. In the aftermath of the Great Depression, governments across Europe and in America too sought to overcome the discrepancy between production potential and the capacity of markets. Kalesky and Kovalich point out that with initially fairly strong opposition from the grande bourgeoisie, Capitalist governments wanted to protect the foundations of their system from the threat of mass unemployment. The people who'd lived through the Great Depression had seen the effects of unemployment firsthand, and they didn't want to go through that again. So government intervention was broadly accepted as the best way to fill this gap of insufficient demand and organise additional employment during this period. Now, after 1945, however, the capitalist system began to be one of the large corporations and also military government consumption. Some scholars have called this the military Keynesianism of the Cold War period. So due to the Cold War, powers in Europe and America were wanting to shore up their defences, and military production and consumption was one way in which effective demand was boosted, leading to low rates of unemployment and also higher levels of spending. War economies can be very good for overcoming unemployment. As Kalesky points out, a capitalist system of large corporations with supplementary markets guaranteed by government purchases, mainly of armaments, allow the realisation of accumulated profits. The share of government expenditure is the total demand for goods and services increased, and this increased considerably after 1945 in comparison to the interwar period. This had important political effects. There was a real and genuine commitment to full employment. As Hobsbawm points out, by the 1960s, unemployment rates across Europe were just above 1%. And the average West European unemployment stood at 1.5% in the 1960s. Italy took longer in the 1950s, with still around 8% out of work. But much of Western Europe was at almost minimal unemployment. By the 1960s, both in Japan and Europe, Japan was only at 1.3% unemployment, and Western Europe, as I've said, was at 1.5%. So Kalesky and Kovalich point out that up until 1945, that there'd been centrally controlled capitalism of the war years, that after the war was able to then target unemployment as the problem and really significantly reduce the sorts of levels of unemployment that one would have expected to otherwise see coming out of war. So there was a real genuine commitment to full employment. Social security had been expanded, and this changed the very nature of working class sympathies and sentiments. The working class became much more reformist in its attitude to capitalism, and anti-capitalist attitudes weakened considerably. Now, at a time when one might have expected student protest to be at a low due to the increased prosperity of the working class beyond levels that they'd ever experienced prior to this, one might not have expected student protest. But Eric Hobsbawm and Kalesky and Kovalich all point out that access to greater material comfort and education associated with these changes meant that the next generation, the younger generation, were looking back critically on their past, the way in which their parents had been treated as part of the working class. And those students were demanding more. So new material prosperity for the working classes was actually ironically and perhaps unexpectedly associated with increasing critical capacity for reflection. And so we saw the emergence of student protests across Europe and even in Japan, in working class protests, the student-driven protests of students whose families had previously been working class, who were now demanding more, even though they were accessing levels of material prosperity that they'd never before experienced. And this led to reflections on the declining ability of the bourgeois power apparatus to manipulate new generations entering the historical stage. John King points out in a 2003 article that I've referenced at the back of these slides that during this golden age, the crucial post-Keynesian reform involved all 5 principles of what's now referred to as post-war reformist democratic socialism. So we clearly had this quite strong commitment by government to the Keynesian idea of full employment. And I'll go look at those 5 elements on the next slide. So during the golden age, this crucial post-Keynesian period of reform involved all 5 principles of post-war reformist democratic socialism. We have a firm government commitment to full employment. We have a unionised and tightly regulated labour market. And you can see these characteristics are not characteristics of the approach of global north economies today. There is no commitment to full employment. There's an amount of unemployment that's viewed as reasonable to accept. There has been an undermining of unionisation. Labour markets are not tightly regulated. But in the post-war period, these were characteristics of the economy. A firm government commitment to full employment, a unionised and tightly regulated labour market. So we recall that back in the interwar period during the Great Depression in North America, Keynesianism had actually encouraged unionisation in order to secure better conditions for workers in order to boost consumption. The idea was that if workers had a living wage and the ability to consume more than the requirements of productive efficiency, then this would be good for production overall as well. It would boost effective demand for goods in the product market, and producers themselves would be willing to employ more people. Unionisation, it was recognised, could play an important role in this. The third principle was highly progressive taxation, and we'll speak a little bit more about that later. We also saw a substantial and comprehensive welfare state with social security, health and the like. And finally, there's the public ownership of public utilities and other important natural monopolies. John King wants to add perhaps a 6th principle to those 5 standard principles of post-war reformist democratic socialism that are linked to this post-Keynesian period of the crucial reform that Kalesky speaks of. He thinks that we should add cheap money and with it the taming of the financial sector. This will lead to Minsky's concerns. So we will be discussing that further as well. Now, if Kalesky thinks that the problem of unemployment will be resolved by boosting demand, effective demand, he's also very aware that there are political aspects, the political business cycle, which has the capacity to undermine any commitment to full employment, even if full employment would be to the mutual benefit of both producer and employee. The article that you're asked to read from 1943 begins with Kalesky defining the economic consensus. He says, everyone agrees in 1943 that the aim of economics is full employment through effective demand. Now, interestingly, how far have we come today? There is no consensus about that today. Full employment at levels of 1%, like the post-war European nations saw, just doesn't exist. Everyone also agrees, says Kalesky, on how to achieve this through government spending, through fiscal policy designed to employ all existing labour power. He agrees, he says that economists agree that this requires public investment, building schools, hospitals and highways, as well as subsidising mass consumption through family allowances, reduction of sales tax and subsidies to keep down necessities. Now, economists in 1943 also agreed on how to finance this through borrowing and not through taxation. Because taxation, it was thought, would adversely affect private investment and consumption, and ultimately private investment could take over in many respects from government. Kalesky notes that there'll still be unemployment in the economy Because an economy that has conceptually achieved the concept of full employment will still have what's called no demand deficient unemployment. No unemployment that results, so there'll be no unemployment that results from a deficiency in effective demand. So Kalesky argues that business leaders do not actually want full employment, even if it might increase their profits. Why? Well, they dislike government interference into the problem of employment. If you go to your text, which I'm doing now, you'll note that he discusses this further. He says that if in a laissez-faire system, the level of employment depends to a great extent on the confidence of producers to employ workers to produce their products. So, and if producer confidence deteriorates, then private investment declines. And this actually then gives capitalists a really powerful indirect control over government, because they can say to government, well, if you do this, then you're going to shake the state of confidence. If you try to regulate financial markets, for example, you're going to shake the state of confidence, business leaders might say to government. And you can't do that, business leaders say to government, because then you're going to be, in effect, creating unemployment and causing an economic crisis. So capitalists kind of like that power, says Kalesky. Kalesky points out that once governments actually learn this trick themselves of being able to increase employment by themselves, then capitalists don't have this powerful controlling device over them anymore. But business leaders obviously don't like this. They like to have power over government. So the business leaders, if they don't like the direction of government spending, really want to curtail that because it's in their own interests. Business leaders, says Kalesky, understand that the direction of government spending is actually disproportionately to the benefit of the least well off. And again, that's not really in the interests of the capitalist. Business leaders also can insulate themselves temporarily from an economic crisis in ways that the working class can't. The unemployed can't do this like business leaders. So if government spending is on public investment and in subsidising the consumption of the least well-off, who are most likely to spend, then this is going to still disproportionately benefit the working class, even if business leaders also themselves benefit by being able to reap greater profit from workers being able to consume. So Kalesky says that the business leaders really don't like the fact that workers benefit more than they benefit, even if benefit is mutual. Relative benefits are not equal in their view, and that's probably true. One would expect, if business leaders are using the classical logic, that they would be very happy to increase their profits, even if working classes are increasing theirs. Even if the working class are disproportionately having more preferences satisfied than the business class, everybody is getting something more. But Kalesky thinks that doesn't occur. Business leaders really don't want working class people to have a disproportionate benefit. Business leaders also dislike the social and political changes that result from the maintenance of full employment. So remember what I said about the student protests before. This is what would have led to student protests, according to Kalesky. Eric Hobsbawm, for example, has made this point in his book. Because there's a greater sense of entitlement now on the part of working class for improvements in conditions of work, for wage increases, a self-assurance and a class consciousness, then discipline in factories goes down. And Kalesky makes the point that business leaders really tend to not want this. And it seems odd and go against the neoclassical logic, but business leaders in practice actually appreciate discipline in factories and political stability more than profits. Their class instinct tells them that lasting full employment is unsound from their own point of view, and that unemployment is an integral part of the normal capitalist system, according to Kalesky. So that's why Kalesky thinks that it's really unlikely that full employment will be maintained, even if it's really to the mutual benefit of both, be it disproportionately beneficial to the least well-off, which really the business class doesn't want. So Kalesky thinks that unless capitalism is full employment capitalism, it should be scrapped. Full employment capitalism will, of course, have to develop new social and political institutions which reflect then the increased power of the working class. And if capitalism can adjust itself to full employment and its effects and its requirements, then great. But if not, it will show itself to be outmoded. And it must be, Kalesky argues, be scrapped. So we can see this is why Kalesky counts as a kind of Marxian post-Keynesian thinker. And it's this tradition of thinking that John King, the emeritus professor whose text I've set as required reading and who used to teach at La Trobe for a long time, it's in this tradition that John King's work is located. As John King will put it in the text that you're required to read for this week, Kalesky is in this sense a post-Keynesian with a Marxist spirit, because he retains the view that the class divide is going to remain essential here. It's unlikely that capitalism will retain its commitment to crucially reforming itself because of this class divide. So this is why Kalesky offers reserved support for capitalism, while still maintaining the right to revolution if full employment is not ensured. And what happened after Kalesky's 1971 article on the crucial reform? Well, his 1943 article proved to be correct. The crucial reform was reversed. Again, I'm following John King here, and that is a required reading that I made in addition to the Stilwell and Argyris combination of texts that they've asked you to read. So what we see happening across the latter half of the century, from the 1970s onwards, is the collapse of the Bretton Woods system of fixed exchange rates. And this led to increased financial instability. But in a context of increased financial instability, there's also an opportunity for financial speculation, higher scope for financial speculation, for higher profits, and a greater political influence for financial interests. So this will be a nice segue to Minsky. The breakdown of the Bretton Woods system also contributed to the acceleration of inflation throughout the capitalist world, because the constraints formerly imposed on the domestic price level by the need to defend the exchange rate had been removed. So price inflation occurred, and this led to lower investments, obviously, because when there's price inflation, there's also lower investments, slower growth and higher unemployment. When prices go up, when inflation occurs, investments decrease with higher unemployment. One even saw a greater increase in the share of profits accruing to the finance, the insurance and the real estate market sectors as these became deregulated. Non-financial corporations themselves were increasingly driven by shareholder value. If you recall the Netflix explainer on the stock market that I provided for you last week, you'll remember that Milton Friedman comes out during this period and says quite explicitly, greed is good. We have to be driven by shareholder interests and by the imperative of profit, and not by broader considerations of employee interests and other interests than the community interests at large, says Milton Friedman, in effect. So government policy in this way became dominated by the interests of financial capital. And we saw the deregulation of the financial markets, the deregulation of the real estate market, the deregulation of banks. We saw in microeconomics the deregulation of the financial market. In macroeconomics, a fixation on inflation targeting. And we saw a complete abandonment of any attempt to maintain full employment. I remember this incredibly well myself, the recession we had to have in the 80s, in the late 80s, where my father remained unemployed for years, working then in casual employment behind the bar, all hours until the early morning as a breakfast cook. This was not a very good period of time for workers who had less human capital. This recession lasted several years, and unemployment and casualisation then lasted many years. We also see, as John King points out, an increasing involvement of all but the very poor in financial markets, and the ideological dominance then of neoliberal ideas, even among working class people who then have some involvement in these matters through superannuation funds and the like, entirely at the mercy of financial markets. So we can see that the crucial reform was reversed during this period. So with the reversing of the crucial reforms across this period from the mid-1970s onwards, we see further effects, including the weakening of the unions, due in part to mass unemployment, helped by repressive legislation. Mass unemployment gave the unions very little wiggle room. We also saw tax systems becoming much less progressive, with a shift from direct taxation to indirect forms of taxation, like consumption tax. We see reductions in the higher marginal rates of income tax. We see big drops during this period in America of higher marginal rates of income tax. We see concessions on the taxation of capital gains, which had previously permitted equalising contributions in the post-war period. Taxing capital gains had previously been a method that post-war governments had used to gain unequal contributions based on the ability to pay as a function of how much you had. So the less well-off had to pay less. The more well-off, the better well-off had to pay more in order to recover from war. John King notes that we see the abolition of local government rates in England, welfare benefits reduced, especially for the unemployed, with harsh eligibility conditions, a tendency to privatise. As for the effects on economic theory, we see the emasculation, says John King, of fiscal policy. So the effects on economic policy include the emasculation of fiscal policy, which we recall is the policies that governments employed using public investment and boosting consumer spending in order to increase effective demand. We didn't really see a return to Keynesian or post-Keynesian thinking until the global financial crisis of 2008. So this period in Australia from the late 1970s, the early 80s onwards, really brought in neoliberal policies undermining the Keynesian consensus that had existed across most economies in the global north up until the mid-1970s. In 2008, when there was that massive global financial crisis, our treasurer, Wayne Swan, from the Labour Party, made use of techniques to boost effective demand and overcome employment. Prior to this, we'd seen both the Hawke and the Keating government and then the Howard government bringing these techniques of economic rationalisation discussed on the previous slide. Bob Hawke and Paul Keating were Labour and Howard was a Liberal coalition. And so across the 80s and the 90s and into the 2000s, we really saw the restriction of monetary policy to control and contain inflation, and the reduction of any use of fiscal policy. The way governments thought about the economy changed dramatically from the mid-1970s onwards. There was no more Keynesian consensus after that. Before I get to that next point, I put it on a little too early, I want to say that Elizabeth Humphreys from the University of Sydney published a book a few years back called How Labour Built Neoliberalism, where Labour was spelt without a U. And it's not obviously a misspelling. The Labour is meant to be without the U. She meant that even the trade unions were caught up during the Hawke and the Keating era in the undermining of those protections and techniques that had previously characterised the post-war economies. And when she posted a tweet a couple of years back when her book was produced, she posted about her book, Wayne Swan actually retweeted her own tweet with the comment, "Rubbish." So when Elizabeth Humphreys posted her tweet on how Labour, without a U, built neoliberalism, his retweet said "rubbish," to which Elizabeth Humphreys replied, and I love this, I'll quote it for you to make it worthwhile for you guys who are listening all the way to the end. You get these little tidbits, right? So Elizabeth Humphreys wrote, quote, "While I was really hoping for an endorsement from the 2011 Euro Money Magazine Finance Minister of the Year, my book is available for purchase through Haymarket Books if you would like to see the ways in which Wayne is incorrect." Nice. So if you're interested in this question, have a look at Elizabeth Humphreys' fantastic book on how Labour, without a U, built neoliberalism during this period that we're talking about. So we see the emasculation of fiscal policy, the restriction of monetary policy by central banks to containing inflation. We see no interest in boosting effective demand anymore. We see the adoption of a methodological dogma of micro foundations. And this will be interesting to you who are studying Eco 1 RIG. This is the claim that macroeconomics should and must be reduced to microeconomics. And this is quite different to the Keynesian approach and the post-Keynesian approach. So we saw, in a sense, economists themselves in the mid-1970s providing a very powerful ideological justification for abandoning this crucial reform, just after the time in which Keynes had actually complimented capitalism for doing so well to guarantee full employment. And this leads very nicely to Minsky's analysis of the inherent instability of financial markets and the ability to wreak absolute havoc, as we saw in the global financial crisis of 2008. Only an economics that is critical of capitalism can be a guide to successful policy for capitalism, Minsky thinks. The disciples of Minsky in the contemporary world, people like Stephen Keen, have taken it as a badge of honour for them to be able to say that they were able to predict the global financial crisis when the entire discipline of economics was unable to do so, because they'd read Minsky. They thought they'd been able to predict the global financial crisis because they'd read Minsky. They felt Minsky told them something about financial instability and its effect on unemployment that made them able to see that this was going to happen. Hyman Minsky calls himself a financial Keynesian, not a post-Keynesian. Unsurprisingly, he grew up in the Depression. He was born in 1919. So he lived his formative years from age 10 to 20 years old through the Great Depression. He was only 10 years old when the great crash of 1929 occurred. I already told you my own story about my father's unemployment during the recession we had to have, as Paul Keating put it, in the late 1980s. These are stories that stay with us due to their psychological impacts of long-term unemployment on people and their livelihoods, on their relationships, on their families. So we can see why Minsky would have been really attuned to these issues. He studied at the University of Chicago, worked at the Mark Twain banks, which he described as his laboratory. And he was influenced by Keynes's ideas on the causes of economic fluctuations, effective demand, investment expenditure, and uncertainty. He's also influenced by Marxian ideas. And like Keynes, he begins with uncertainty. Uncertainty makes investments volatile, he believes. We remember that from our reading of Keynes and Keynes's analogy between investment and the beauty contest. A collapse of investment leads to unemployment because a crisis of confidence occurs on the part of the producers. You no longer know whether they're going to have products for the markets, and you can no longer take on that risk. Standard economic theory for Minsky focuses on trade and simple production, ignoring historical time in his view. It also ignores money in terms of credit as well. It ignores uncertainty, history. Credit really didn't exist to the same extent in Keynes's period, but it certainly did in Minsky's period. So uncertainty, history, policy, the nature of capital assets, the financial institutions of Wall Street. This is a paper world, quote, a world of commitments to pay cash today and in the future. Keynes's idea about the problem of speculation in the early financial markets of 1929 are now reformulated by Minsky in his own context. The problem of speculation in financial markets. This is a problem that's been increasing, according to Minsky, and in markets that have become increasingly complex. So Minsky's financial instability hypothesis goes something like this. He says, investment in financial markets proceeds in cycles, and this has an enormous impact upon what is referred to as the real economy, production, consumption, jobs, and so forth. So the instability of investments in financial markets has an impact upon the real economy. And so Minsky looks at the types of investments, and he says there are three types of investment in the cycle of the financial market, each of which becomes increasingly risky, leading to a price bubble that eventually bursts. The first stage, according to Minsky, is hedge finance. In the early stages of an upswing, borrowers are actually able to make both their scheduled interest repayments and the necessary repayments of the principal. So let's say I've borrowed $20,000 to purchase a new car. I know that my income will be able to allow me to pay both that interest and principal from cash flows generated by my activities. And I feel very confident in this. Now imagine that I might not be just borrowing to invest in a car. I might be borrowing to invest in a car so that I can undertake an aspect of my business, so that I'm able to generate profit well beyond the money that I owe. If I'm confident that I'm able to pay off that loan quite quickly and generate more profit, then I might be willing to undertake more risky forms of investment. And Minsky calls this speculative finance, and he thinks this becomes more and more typical. In forms of speculative finance, I might actually only be able to make the scheduled interest payments and a proportion of principal commitments, but less than before. But because I know I feel confident that I've got profit coming in, I'm willing to undertake these riskier speculative investments because I think maybe I'll be able to quickly on-sell these investments at a higher rate if they involve stock and so on. Now, in a third stage, Ponzi finance appears, and this is at the very end of a boom. According to this stage, borrowers are actually unable to even pay interest, and they're actually incurring further debts in order to pay the interest on their loans. So this is very risky. But it's what Minsky thinks people do when they become so confident in a period of boom that they don't think it's risky for them. The result, according to Minsky, is financial fragility, which increases rapidly, and soon the cycle turns into a downward spiral before confidence then recovers and the entire process begins all over again. This is the boom-bust crisis scenario of Heilbronner that we read about a while ago in the Marxian readings as well. So Ponzi units, Minsky points out, are the most vulnerable to a crisis in confidence, because as soon as it looks like people might be selling their stock quickly in order to shore up their position, this then leads others to do so too, and the value of Ponzi units just quickly evaporates as people sell them for lower and lower rates. And this then turns even the speculative units into Ponzi units, repeating the process. As we saw in the 2008 GFC, this can wreak havoc in the real economy, producing a crisis of confidence due to the loss of investments, leading employers to reduce their workforce, leading to unemployment caused by financial instability. And so here we have another diagnosis of the causes of unemployment, requiring a different form of solution given the complexity of financial markets in which we operate today. And I'll turn to John King's 2013 piece, which provides some ideas on the future of capitalism, a sort of return of sorts in a new context to the crucial reform. So this return of sorts to the crucial reform would require both definancialization and a regulation of financial markets to ensure that risk is moderated, so that speculative finance does not turn into Ponzi finance, and so that the primary source of finance remains hedge finance, secure and stable. This, John King suggests, goes hand in hand with deprivatization or the resocialization of housing and pensions, so that risks are then transferred from individuals back to society. But John King thinks this is unlikely. This sort of crucial reform in a new Minsky world is unlikely, unless, for John King, there's a global depression of 1930s proportions. So it might be that we don't have the political will to undertake these necessary and crucial reforms. But if the analysis of Minsky is right, there will inevitably be another period of bust coming. And we will need to deal with this eventually, if his theory is right, given the cyclic nature of risk. A further option that John King provocatively considers, well, he doesn't think it's provocative, but he thinks it's realistic. A further option is to boost effective demand through a return to military Keynesianism. And this could be possible, he says, due to a growing imperialist rivalry between the US and China. And we've already seen a militarization in other contexts in the world with effects on the economy. We've noted in the week on institutionalism how economists have already, from various different schools, noticed how production can be increased on account of war. War is an effective way of increasing demand, boosting employment, and finding some form of crucial reform to capitalism. Although returning to the institutionalist view of political economy, one would have to say that wartime investment is not a sustainable mode of long-term economic prosperity, but certainly it improves GDP. A further option John King mentions is a decline of the global north and the emergence of China as the mid-21st century global hegemon, a capitalism with Chinese characteristics, unlikely to be a laissez-faire economy, and one likely to be mixed in with planning. So these are some of the ideas that John King ends his article. These are the sorts of avenues for crucial reform in a Minsky environment, he believes, in the environment that Minsky describes so well. Let's briefly consider Frank Stilwell's questions now, as we always do each week. Who benefits? Who loses? Does it matter? So who benefits from implementing post-Keynesian theory, post-Keynesian political economy? Well, the answers are going to be similar to those I provided last week for Keynesian political economy. Post-Keynesians, according to Kalesky, would be of the view that everyone stands to benefit from implementing post-Keynesian ideas about the economy. Everyone stands to benefit from boosting effective demand and ensuring full employment. Even business leaders stand to gain. This would increase the profits that business leaders could themselves expect. However, in response to the second question, who loses? We now know from Kalesky's own examination of the political impediments to instituting full employment over the long term that the benefits are disproportionately experienced by the least well-off. And the capitalists don't like this, even if they still benefit. They don't benefit as much. So there's a loss of relative power, which could lead to a desire for greater socio-political power as well, they fear. Let's not give the working class too much, because who knows what else they will want. The business leaders enjoy, according to Kalesky, the power of the government that comes with the effects of their own decisions, their own business decisions on unemployment levels. And if government hasn't yet learned how to respond in order to boost demand and to prop up employment by themselves, then business leaders can continue to enjoy that power over the working class and over government. So business leaders stand to lose that power if post-Keynesian approaches are implemented, even if business leaders would still benefit in terms of profit. Doesn't matter. Well, Minsky would say that the financial instability hypothesis makes it likely that we will face a severe global financial crisis in a cyclical manner. If we don't do something to regulate the risk involved in financial markets, then we'll inevitably face this again. So yes, it does matter. To close, here are some of the references that I used in this lecture.